So this research, as Professor Salzman said, is informed by a number of strands. The latest one is the idea of Iran in Ottoman world. Because today, if you look at the Middle East, two critical map-making and border formations have shaped the Middle East geopolitical, ethno-religious, and political fault lines. The one we know most about is, of course, the post-World War, First World War, Anglo-French geopolitical engineering, which has been researched, talked about. But other one is the making of Ottoman Iranian boundaries, which today Iran, Iraq, and Turkey share. And the making of those boundaries that you kind of see the map that I will come later, but what you see here, it took about 400 years. Now, this was one of the issues that I wanted to find out. But another issue that informed my kind of delving into what Iran meant for the Ottoman Empire was inspired by more recent events, especially when ISIS emerged. They will issue fatwas, religious edicts, denouncing Iranians and infidels, and they will call them the Safavids. Now, for those of you who do not know, Safavids are a dynasty that ruled Iran from 1501 to 1722. They are responsible for turning Iran into a Shia country. Then there was a very famous cleric, Egyptian cleric, who lived in Qatar. He will also issue fatwas. And this guy, when I say influential, he was, I think, with tens of millions of social media followers. And he will refer the Iraqis and the Syrian government as the Safavids. So one of the ideas I had, Charles Tilly has this notion of a repertoire of contention. How come at the time of contention and time of war, people so easily found a language to denounce their rivals, the others? And I wanted to look into kind of being a historian to see what is the historical background of this. And of course, historical background in my mind is you have to go to Ottoman Iranian contention and to see what was happening. Now, the border that I'm talking about from Caucasus to the Persian Gulf, as Owen Lattimore, a historian of China, says, is an ancient interacting frontier rather than a southern one. Its final shape is a product of the process of territorialization of sovereignty and the transition from suzerain to sovereign reality, marked by transformation of peripheral governance from indirect to direct role. Those are some of the issues that I'm hoping to kind of go over. And I will be using the notions of borderland and frontier kind of identically, and I will also use border and boundary identically. There's a lot of literature about this, which we will not be able to go into, but please bear with me when I use those terms interchangeably. And a long-durée look at Ottoman-Iranian negotiations regarding the frontiers spanning centuries shows that this border functioned as, the negotiations functioned as stages in transforming the borderlands into a boundary. This is one of the concepts that American historians used. How do we transfer borderlands into boundaries? And this is what I was trying to see in this borderland. The other issue I looked, aside from the notion of territoriality and sovereignty, is the notion of secularization. I wanted to see how the negotiations over borders secularized the Ottoman-Iran relations. By secularization, I mean a transformation from a relationship based on religio-ideological contention to one predicated on international coexistence and mutual recognition of territorial sovereignty and the differences that come with it. So as Fernand Braudel talked about boundaries, when he talked about boundaries in Mediterranean, he says, we should imagine hundreds of boundaries, some cultural, some ethnic, some commercial, some physical, and what have you. So I will leave most of them behind, and I want to concentrate on three types of frontiers. One is religio-ideological, two, geopolitical, and three, medical. So I will try to show how the first two evolved in relation to one another and with regard to developments in other parts of the world, especially Europe. However, the developments surrounding the third one, that is the medical, accelerated transformation of this borderland into a more defined boundary. That's why I will conclude my talk with a very specific cross-border movement, namely the transport of dead Shia bodies for burial in Ottoman Iraq, and the outbreak of cholera. How they transform this boundary is going to be the focus of my talk. So by highlighting this rather peculiar dead bodies crossing borders, I aim to show how it helped regularize the crossing of the living bodies across frontiers. So when you look at this boundary, it has been a region of contention from the time of Greek to Persian empires, and then later it becomes a passageway for the invading armies of the Mongols and the Turks and the Arabs, one way or another. And then in 1501, this region from, if you can see well, from Armenia, Georgia, down to Basra and Baghdad, became an area, a stage for Ottoman and Safavid contention. Now, what is interesting about the Ottomans and Safavids, they started their careers almost around the same time. The one in Iran will start as a religious brotherhood. The Ottomans started as a small principality. But by 1501, the Safavid order became a temporal power, became an empire, a state. By the time, of course, Ottomans were a state 200 years old. Now, the first Safavid ruler, called Ismail, or Shah Ismail, should have his name here. His aggressive expansionism and messianic appeal among the Anatolian masses aroused Ottoman antagonism. Now, this is, in my understanding, a revolution, the Safavid state formation. It's a Shia revolution with its revolutionary missionaries going over Anatolia, and hundreds of thousands of people are answering the call of the Shah, as it's called. In Turkey, if you still go and listen to the folk songs of the Alevis, it's still about going to the Shah. There is this yearning to go and be with the Shah because it's a messianic movement. So this, if you can, if you look at the map, it's a problem for the Ottomans. You have this revolutionary movement here, and then his appeal to Anatolia and people responding to this call is a problem. So the question of borders and how to stop people crossing borders emerges as one of the issues in Ottoman-Iranian relations very early on. So how are you going to control a borderland? And more importantly, how to stop a revolution expanding? And the world, almost 400, more than 400 years later, will of course face the same question in Iran when the Islamic Revolution happened in 79 and start to expand its influence over the region or globally. That became a problem in our time as well. So the Ottoman Sultan of the time, Sultan Selim I, who came to power with a coup d'etat of sorts, he was decided on stopping the revolution from spreading. Now the problem, of course, is how to define Iran. That's a kind of inspiration for my paper, right? Is it an Islamic state or is it a non-Islamic state? And in Islamic understanding, the way you define a state defines your relations with them, right? If it's an infidel state, you can declare jihad, right, if you are going to, and you can wage a war against them. But if it's a Muslim state, you are running into a problem. Regardless, Muslims being fighting each other. Now, so the Ottomans used a common strategy by declaring jihad on other Muslims, in this case, on the grounds of suppressing innovations and punishing the leaders of secession from faith. The idea the Ottomans came up with is this: the Europeans are infidels anyways, but those guys are corrupting our religion. So they're actually more dangerous than the infidels. As a result, they have to be eliminated. So to do that, you have to go to the highest religious authority, which Ottomans did. At the time, there was a gentleman called Mufti Hamza. They asked him, he issued a fatwa, and he warned the Muslims to be aware of them, declaring them to be worse than infidels and apostates. The word he used, kafir and mulhid. And he issued what we call takfiri fatwas and affirmed that it was permissible and even incumbent upon Muslims to kill their men and divide their goods, women, and children, or enslave them, and pronounced any holy warrior who died in this pursuit would be considered a martyr. And that's precisely what happened. When Ottomans defeated the Safavids in 1514, the Iranian envoys and war prisoners were executed, the Safavid capital was sacked, and the women of Qizilbash, including a wife of the Shah himself, were distributed among the Muslims. Now, the perception of the Safavid as a group beyond the pale, who needed to be eradicated from the abode of Islam, reached a crescendo during the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled for a long time. He carried out 4 campaigns into Iran, or against Iranians. Against him was this very famous Shah called Shah Tahmasp, who ruled around the same time. They never directly see each other at the battlefield, because whenever Ottomans will go, Shah Tahmasp will go away and then burn down everything. And then when the Ottomans couldn't do anything or couldn't find them, they will go back. The Iranians will come and take the lands back. Now, what happens during the reign of Shah Tahmasp, of course, the formal denunciation and cursing of key Sunni figures. Now, this is the most important issue for the Ottomans. Iranians, as they become more Shi'i in their confrontation with the Ottomans on the one side and Uzbeks on the other, they institutionalized a ceremony of sorts that you go and denounce the first 3 caliphs of Islam, because they took what rightfully was Ali's, right, their saint, or the most kind of venerated saints. What belonged to Ali was usurped in that idea by the first 3 caliphs, with the cooperation of Muhammad's beloved wife, Aisha. So what they institutionalized is you do cursing ceremonies. Shah Tahmasp became so famous. When you actually read the chronicles of the time, it's really funny to read in a way. He will go to the Sunni mosques, participate in the cursing, and one of the chronicles says he had cursers with voices as loud as buffaloes to curse those caliphs. And when they finish their cursing, everybody will be made increase and not decrease the cursing. And then he will fill their mouths with silver coins, the story goes. Right, so this is a problem for the Ottomans. They want to stop this. Because Ottomans, in 1517, they conquered the Middle East, or invaded the Middle East, and they became the rulers of Arabia and Egypt, and they became the servitors of 2 holy mosques. This is still the title of the king of Saudi Arabia. He doesn't go by the king of Saudi Arabia. He's the servant of the 2 holy mosques. This gives you a lot of legitimacy. But then when you have this role, Iranians constantly cursing the founders of your religion is a problem. And this creates a very serious issue for the Ottomans. So they carried out 4 campaigns. They realized they cannot defeat the Shah. A chronicler of the time says the Ottomans realized that Shah Mat, which is the word checkmate comes from, Ottomans realized that checkmating the Shah or the king was impossible. So they made a treaty. And the treaty was signed in 1555. It's called the Amasya Treaty. And the correspondence before the treaty, I wish we had time to talk about, is really interesting as well. But what is important here, Ottomans recognized the Shia state in Iran as a legitimate entity for the first time. And when we look at the negotiations, when we look at the correspondence, we realize that there are 2 boundaries at stake. One is the religio-ideological boundary that has to be clarified. The other is geopolitical boundary. And with this treaty, Ottomans, in a way, recognized Shi'i Iran as a legitimate entity. And they said, we are going to allow your pilgrims to come to Iraq because Shia sacred sites are not only in Mecca and Medina, but also in 4 Iraqi Shi'i cities. And coming to them is very important for them. So with this treaty, the regimes of border crossing and rules regarding it emerged as one of the most critical components of Ottoman Iranian relations. And they will remain so to the end. As you can imagine, this conceptual turn, of course, did not immediately give rise to linear boundaries. During this era, the frontier cities marked the limits of both powers with transitional zones of fluid authority in between. Now, what happens throughout this period, the borderland peoples, their borders actually define the border of two states. And that's why what I call this period, and I'm of course not alone, other scholars call this with the same name, the relations between states and societies were based on suzerain relations. The lord of the marches, in this case the Kurdish dynasties of the borderland and Arab tribal confederations, whoever they recognize as their suzerain will mark the limits of that state. So the limits of the Ottoman Empire and Iran were not actually the limit of the Sultan and the Shah, but also the limits of the local people. They were guarding their frontiers. So now what is interesting about 1555, and I talk so much about it, in the same year, in Europe, for those of you who are European historians, the Europeans signed the Treaty of Augsburg in 1555. This is the first time Catholic sovereigns, Protestant and Catholic sovereigns in the Holy Roman Empire recognize each other. One could argue that those developments are interrelated, and these processes were part of an intercontinental phenomenon encompassing early modern Eurasia. However, neither the Treaty of Amasya, of course nor that of Augsburg, ended religio-political confrontations they sought to end. In both cases, that is in Europe and the Ottoman Iranian Borderlands, confrontations continued. 30 years after this treaty, Ottomans and Iranians went through the most violent period of their confrontation. One Ottoman chronicle, when he talks about the confrontations in the Caucasus, said the Ottoman armies made towers out of skulls. When one looks at them, one loses their mind. And this is what is really interesting. This is happening almost around the same time when St. Bartholomew massacre was happening in Europe. So again, you see these parallel kind of developments happening. But what happens with those very ferocious times of war in 1570s and 80s, they of course came to a conclusion that, okay, we have to have treaties. And when you look at the treaties they made several of them, as you can see, 1590, 1612, 1618. Again, the issue of border, how to locate the border, and how to deal with the populations at the borderland were at the heart of their negotiations. Now, making treaties is one good thing. The problem is who is going to abide by them. So in Iran, when a very famous Shah Abbas the Great, came to power, Iranians decided it's time to disregard all the previous treaties and push the borderland westward. And they did. They conquered Baghdad and parts of Kurdistan and Caucasus, and Ottomans have to accept what happened. But they signed a treaty, and the treaty, they initiated peace negotiations with a focus on delimiting the boundaries. These treaties, of course, as you can imagine, did not end the fluidity between both powers. Now, what happened when Shah Abbas was gone, when Ottomans got another powerful sultan in the person of a gentleman called Murad I, they started attacking Iran. After 16 years of fighting, they signed the Treaty of Zohab, or Treaty of Kastashrine. One version of this treaty is named Sendername, or a frontier document. So what you see, the contention is about two things still. One, how to define the religio-ideological boundary, but in relation, where is the geopolitical boundary, right? They are doing this. When you look at the treaty, you see that entire regions are designated as borders between those two states. Now, what is interesting about this treaty, similarly, after 30 years of war, 1618 to 48, in which religion played a very primary role, the European states established what has been called the Westphalian state system of 1648, which has been interpreted as the birth of the modern international order. Like the Westphalian system, the 1639 Zohab Treaty emphasized the principle of non-interference in each other's affairs and territorial sovereignty, while offering mutual guarantees for upholding the treaty's terms. Now, the Treaty of Zohab is not as comprehensive as the Treaty of Westphalia, but it discouraged cross-border movements across what they define as border zone, and thus, very much like Westphalia, it made the notion of territorial sovereignty a part of international relations in the Middle East as well. And hence, this treaty is an important one, but not the treaty that defined the borders. By making the definition of borders the goal and making peace conditional on respecting borders, this treaty in the Middle East is a step towards the idea of indivisible sovereignty, even though the change was not immediate. Now, what is important about this treaty? It gave Ottomans and Iranians a long time of peace. But when historians look into it, what they tell us is not because they really wanted to respect the treaty or the borders, but both sides had their own problems. As a result, they had a long period of peace. And the quiet in the eastern frontier, which lasted from 1639 to 1722, freed the Ottomans to settle many scores in the west. However, the end of the Safavid Empire and the Afghan occupation of Iran, which brought an end to the Safavid order, Safavid rule, as Professor Salzman notes, overturned the West Asian order suddenly and radically. It's a big transformation in that part of the world. As you can imagine, the frontiers of 1639 were obliterated immediately. The Ottomans went back to their factory settings. They immediately issued fatwas, religious edicts, right, declaring the lands of Iran to be the abode of war. And the fatwas declared that it's duty of the holy warriors, the Ghazis, to kill men of Shia. And this is the condition it goes. They are required to kill them unless they become Muslims. And this is a thread that runs through the Ottoman-Iranian relations. When Shah Tahmasp, he will send letters to Suleiman. He will say, why are we fighting? Let's have peace. Suleiman will say, no, not until you repent and become a Muslim. Right? So this repertoire of contention that I refer to, that is somehow alive in this region at the time of contention, at time of war, was revived. And this fatwa, the chronicles tell us, that actually refers to a set of fatwas that we did not know before. So they keep publishing those kind of denunciations of Iran and giving them a choice that if you become Muslims, we will let you go, but otherwise we'll destroy and subjugate your communities and enslave your children and women and take over your properties and kill your men. And what is interesting, Ottomans did this against Iran in a friendly relationship with the Russians. Because Safavids were gone, both of them were trying to get the spoils of Safavid disintegration. Now what happens in Iran after the fall of Safavids in 1722? There is a power vacuum, but a gentleman called Nadir Shah emerges out of this. And he pushes the Ottomans back, tries to establish sovereignty over Iran, and signs a treaty with the Ottomans called Treaty of Kordon in 1746. Now, what is really interesting, apparently when he was about to negotiate with the Ottomans, he lamented, how much time has the family of Osman, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty, since the reign of Selim, spent mobilizing troops, expending wealth, and destroying lives to halt the cursing of the first three caliphs. He tried to end this Shia-Sunni rivalry business unsuccessfully, and he died rather unexpectedly or was killed. But the treaty that he made, Treaty of Kordon, formally established a new framework for Ottoman-Iranian relations. This framework, which I define as a secular state-to-state relationship predicated on territorial sovereignty, will necessitate time to develop, but will be irreversible. Now, those developments that I talked about, Charles Mayer, a historian, has described such alignments as transformation of territoriality, in which a bounded territory and control of populations within it increasingly became the premise of state sovereignty. So what we're talking about here is also state formation, right? The stages of state formation, territorial sovereignty. In the Ottoman Iranian Borderland, as in Europe, as you can see here in this chart, this evolving premise of social organization emerged around the mid-17th century with the Zohab and Westphalia, experienced decisive modifications in 18th century with Treaty of Cordon, and culminated in 19th century when states successfully intensified efforts to territorialize, integrate, and reclaim space with the help of new technologies. The resulting contest between states for control over a finite space and its inhabitants is the process of transformation of borderlands into boundaries. So what I'm trying to show here, that this transformation of this borderland, this contentious zone into a boundary, went through many stages, and it was a process rather than a point in time that we have been told in conventional historiography. Now, as you can imagine, of course, Ottoman Iranian frontier did not stay true to treaties. And in Iran, there were various claimants to throne after Nadir Shah. And finally, a new dynasty emerged in Iran called the Qajar dynasty in 1796, and it will stay in power in 1925. So the Qajars, a Turkic tribe, they tried to establish authority over the lands that Safavid ruled. And their rule marked the commencement of a renewed phase of Ottoman-Iranian rivalry in which the borderland issues emerged among the most contentious. Now, as I try to emphasize, this borderland, kind of like a pendulum, moved east to west, and it was dependent, the place of the border was mostly dependent on the power of those respective states. So when Ottomans in 1820s were fighting the Greeks in the west, Iranians immediately saw an opportunity to move the border west. Two Iranian princes, the Qajars had too many of them, who were rivals for the throne, but ruling the borderland provinces, they immediately waged war on the Ottomans. And their goal is to push the frontier westward. Now, what happens, of course, an unexpected turn of events saw the cessation of Iranian advances and the death of one of the expansionist princes, brought about by a new global force. This force, indifferent to sectarian or national identities and oblivious to geopolitical boundaries, was cholera. One of the princes died of cholera. Iranian army has to withdraw. And this infectious and lethal disease heralded the event of a novel frontier, the medical one. So Ottomans and Iranians came together. They said, okay, let's have a treaty. And this is called the First Erzurum Treaty of 1823. Now, what is interesting about this one, again, if we switch our lens to Europe, 8 years before this treaty, Europeans came together and signed another accord, right? The Congress of Vienna agreed to participate, European states agreed to participate in what's called the Concert of Europe, which finalized European boundaries in a way mutually tolerable to important powers and guaranteed the resulting territorial arrangements through a series of interlocking treaties. Now, what is important about this? Negotiations lasted for some time in Erzurum, in a borderland town. They signed the treaty, and the Ottoman delegation, after signing the treaty, realized they did not mention any points of religious contention. The Shi'i-Sunni issues were not mentioned in the treaty. And they panicked, because you have an ideological frontier that is there that have to be redefined. But this time, like this evolution, this process actually, and the rise of medical frontier pushed the religio-ideological frontier away and makes the geopolitical frontier a reality. And then they sent messengers to Istanbul and they said, it's okay. We are getting beyond this kind of divide, right? And it became the first treaty that did not address Shia or Sunni points of contention. Now, what these treaties do, of course, they emphasize a border crossing, right? Especially the nomadic populations. Now, what happens in this borderland, what the borderland does, most of the people in this borderland had summer and winter pastures because they are herd dependent, as Ozan Pehlivan, one of your graduates, put it, right? They are herd dependent people. Wherever their herds take them, especially the nomadic and semi-nomadic pastoralists, right? That's where their lives is. And it doesn't regard where the state boundaries are because the pasture is right there, you have to go. But this making of the borders and this treaty explicitly told them, you can't do this anymore. So this is the beginning of the idea of citizenship in the Middle East as well, right? We're having transformation from subject to citizen, if we borrow from Eugene Weber, right? This is the transformation of the tribesmen into Ottomans and Iranians. That is still an ongoing process. But the making of borders force those people to choose the citizenship of Iran or the Ottoman Empire. So the making the borders, right, for states is a very different process, but for the people who live in that borderland, the borderlanders, are very different processes for them. And this was accompanied, of course, with the elimination of the local dynasties, which is also a global process, very much like the other processes that we talk about. It happens in other parts of the world as well. So the Kurdish dynasties their rule were ended because they were ruling those regions indirectly. And this is the transformation, what I talked about at the beginning of my talk, transition from indirect to direct rule. So instead of having the lords of the marches to rule their regions, but have also recognized Sultan suzerainty, that becomes irrelevant, right? We are transitioning to the time of territorial sovereignty, so it doesn't matter what the Lord of the Marches, the borderland, says. We're going to end his rule, and we're going to extend territorial sovereignty to this point, right? And as a result, you have to force the nomads to settle, and you end the indirect rule of local dynasties with direct rule of imperial appointees. So we are talking about several processes, right, together here. So let me move to kind of towards my conclusion with what I promise I will do, the dead bodies. Now, what we're talking about also is the increase in the capacity of states, right? By taking those measures, those states are also helping each other to form their statehood, increase their state capacity, right? When you mark the territorial limits of a state, you have the bounds of your authority. And with the pacification of the borderland, with forced settlements, it's also called the reform period, especially in the Ottoman Empire, less successful reform period in Iran, you are expanding state authority, you are increasing the capacity of state, right? Now, the best testing ground for this capacity was the ability to enforce, in my mind, the medical frontiers. And nothing helps locate the medical frontier better than dead bodies trying to cross it. Now, where this dead body issue comes from, it's a very peculiar issue. There are two places in the world I know that people want to be buried because they want to be resurrected first when the end of time comes. One is the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. The other one, not one, but many of those cemeteries, including this one that is reported to be the biggest in Najaf in Iraq, the Shiis, for centuries, but especially in the 19th century, it became more fashionable to take the Shia faithful and bury them in the cemeteries of Najaf, Kazamain, Samarra, and Karbala. These cities, the burial sites of Shia imams, or the most revered saints, aside from a short period, were under the Ottoman authority. Now, Ottomans are facing a very serious problem. What to do with those caravans? As you can see, especially in summer, when those caravans are coming, and you can imagine the stench and the bacteria and viruses, whatever that might come with them, and those are drawn by British travelers. One of them is pilgrims and corpses, and the other one, just a caravan carrying corpses to Iran. Now, to Iraq. The trade, and I call it trade because it has a lot of economic activities. When you bring those, there are tax farmers going over all of Iran, collecting dead bodies to be buried in Iraq. Now comes cholera, 1821. From Russia, it spreads to the Ottoman Empire, and to the other parts of the Middle East. British soldiers actually first bring cholera from India to Oman. The question is, what are we going to do? Ottoman Empire immediately started establishing quarantine stations in 1830s. They formed a ministry of quarantine. But the problem is, until that time, methods to stop an epidemic were ad hoc. We do not have international norms, right? But the emergence of Asiatic cholera, which will go through phases all over the world, necessitated global measures to prevent its spread. And what made it worse, of course, is the advancements in steamship technology, right? Made diseases like cholera to expand much more faster, and this complicated the issue. So the sanitary matters assumed a greater role in international relations, and quarantine became identified with national interests and the welfare of humanity. As the victims of COVID, I think we can understand this very well. But there was no international standard, and Europeans wanted the first line of defense against cholera to be as far from Europe as it should be. Literally, designated as the sick man of Europe, Ottoman Empire has to take measures so that Europe will not get sick. And what you do, how are you going to do this? The world came together, and in 1851, first International Sanitary Conference was convened in Paris. It did not reach conclusions on key issues, but agreed in principle upon the basic aim of achieving agreement internationally over sanitary regulations, as well as the desirability of some specific measures, including the strengthening of sanitary surveillance in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Now, you can ask for increasing surveillance, but increasing surveillance is only possible with demarcated boundaries. If you don't have boundaries, where are you going to set up quarantine stations and lazarettos? Who cares how many resolutions the International Sanitary Conference passes, right? And the source of cholera was seen at the time, it was India, but the pilgrims from India coming to Mecca and Iranian pilgrims closer to India coming to Mecca and coming to Iraq start emerging as an important problem. So the need for a medical frontier was making the religio-ideological frontier obsolete and the geopolitical frontier a tangible reality. Now, how the border, Ottoman Iranian border, became part of this whole process. Ottomans and Iranians in 1840s were going to have another war because of the border. And Russia and Britain came in because they were increasingly becoming part of the Middle Eastern geopolitics. They said, no, we're going to have a Congress. The Ottoman, Iranian, Russian, and British delegates came together in the city where they signed the treaties, Erzurum. For 3 years, they tried to negotiate this border. Where is the border? They couldn't decide. Then they set up a survey commission that worked for another 3 years, and I spent years reading, of course, their records. They went over the borders, which is the marshes and deserts and plains and high mountains. But what's important about the composition of this survey? It has thousands of soldiers accompanying them. They have cartographers, they have botanists, they have zoologists, they have delegates, diplomats. As it goes, an army is marching over where the border is supposed to be and asking people how to locate this border. So by doing this, they are doing two things, right? They are deciding where the border is, but also inscribing the idea of border in the minds of a people who did not really recognize those borders. So the survey was completed, and they were going to make a map of that border. They said, this should take about 6 months. As you can imagine, it took 12 years, because there was a war in between, the Crimean War, and the Russian and British cartographers and engineers, not the Ottomans and Iranians, made the first map of the Ottoman Iranian borders called carte d'identique, the identic map of the border. And what happens, those are some of the maps I'm showing you, and I want you to pay attention to, let me go to the other one, to how do you negotiate a border? So those are some of the maps that they made at that time. Now, the Ottomans are saying the border is here. Iranians saying, no, the border is here. The International Commission says the border is here. So the issue is how you're going to make those two sides abide, right, by the border that actually you are saying that where it is. So what happened, the map that they made was something like this. It was a region. So 300-something years of transformation of this territoriality did not give us a clear border. And the Ottomans, when this map came on, they said, no, this is how we're going to do. The border actually is here. Iranians, of course, had said, no, it's here. And the International Commission had here. And they made a zone of the border. When the map was concluded, they realized they have 4,000 points of disagreement. So this border that has been negotiated over and over was not really there. And the reason, as I said, is because the relations, the border was not really the border of states, but was the border of the peoples, right? And then those people have to be turned into the citizens of the Ottoman Empire and Iran. The border have to be pacified, state has to increase capacity, and make those tribesmen, turn them into the citizens of Iran and the Ottoman Empire. But what happens, the border map was completed in 1869, and this is the first time we have a map of this border. Now, of course, as you can imagine, during that time, cholera was going on, and the dead and living bodies are crossing the frontiers, and the international sanitary conferences were going on. Now, international sanitary conferences, the precursors of World Health Organization, right, another actor that we come to know during COVID, is actually started as part of those conferences. And they are passing resolutions that the borders have to be controlled, quarantine stations have to be settled, and especially pilgrims and corpses from Iran and the other parts of the Islamic world have to be taken under control because Europe is getting sick, right? And those societies themselves are getting sick as well. So the Ottomans and Iranians and Russians, of course, they all see themselves as modern empires like the Europeans, so they actually spring to action. They try to do what they could do. So Ottomans have to deal with this issue and control of the borders. Now, what this does, as we follow the records of the time, that Ottomans are in accordance with the international sanitary conferences, are asking identity papers, are asking for papers to cross the borders, and this is the birth of the passport in a way, right? And passports start emerging in the Middle East as well. So Iranians, the Ottoman Empire sends orders to the border officials, the governors of the borderlands, saying treat Iranians well. But Iranians have to have their passports, their murur tezkeresi as it's called, right, their papers. So Iran, through this process, goes from the abode of war or the abode of Islam, but from this ambiguous state to what Ottomans called the Veli Ejnebiye, a foreign country, right? So quarantine, cholera, and dead bodies, in a way, help Iran to establish normal states with the Ottoman Empire, become a state. And what is really interesting, we see that there are records of Iran as the Veli Ejnebiye registers, they are called foreign state registers, and the foreign state registers for Iran start at this time. Before that, Iran was an ambiguous place for the Ottomans, neither Muslim nor quite kind of infidel. So I see my time ends. Let me end with what happened with the corpses. Two of the most reformist politicians of the Ottoman Empire in Iran, they came together. They signed a treaty in 1871. They said wet bodies, as they were called, or corpses, cannot cross borders. What we're going to do, we're going to require papers from those dead bodies coming to Iran. They will be buried for 3 years. And then only their bones could be transferred to be buried in Ottoman Iraq. And as I was researching this topic, one of the very sad moments was this gentleman who carries the bones of his poor father in a bag of barley. And he tries to smuggle them into Iraq. And he's caught. Right? Previously, it was very easy. But what we are seeing with this gentleman who hid his father's bones in a bag of barley, but was caught and not allowed to bury them in Medinat al-Salam, right, in the largest cemetery, so that he could be resurrected first when the Mahdi or the Messiah comes, right? This tells you that border became a fact for the poor and for the rich. Now, rich, of course, pay the dues and go and bury their dead in Iraq. But for the poor, it became a burial, right? And for the Ottomans, it was a very important issue. And believe it or not, we have the number of people who were actually crossing the border. So the number I was going to show you is every year from Iran, about 30,000 pilgrims come to the Ottoman Empire, and about 5,000 to 6,000 corpses were brought to the Ottoman Empire. But when you look at the money that the empire is making from, the money made from corpses is equal to the money they made from the living bodies going to pilgrimage. So it was an important trade for the Ottomans. And international sanitary conferences, they actually did not know if the dead bodies are carrying cholera. But because of the fear, they forced the Ottomans to enforce their borders. They forced Iran to enforce its borders and help making those borderlands a reality. Now, this reality became finalized right before the First World War. Ottomans and Iranians were again, by Russia and Britain, were forced to have a survey commission with one of my historian heroes as Vladimir Minorsky, as the Russian commissioner. They went through the border, but this time Britain and Russia made a specific demand because they know the map, how Ottomans demand the border in the east, Iranian demand the border in the west. They say, no, we are going to be arbiters. We are not mediators anymore. So Russian, British, Ottoman, and Iranian commissioners, they went over the boundary and they marked the border stones and finally made the map. And they said, okay, this is where the border is. And they finished 3 days after the end of the First World War, because now they are enemies. The Russian and British members of the commission literally escaped to Caucasus. When the Ottomans went back to Istanbul, Iranians went to Iran, and this gave us a border that took 400 years exactly to the date to be made. And that is the story. Thank you for listening.